Hey little Mead, nice to see you. It's story time again. I have chosen one of my favourite authors, Roald Dahl, and I'm going to be reading you a couple of chapters of the Twits, and then tomorrow I'll read you a few more chapters, and every day this week we will have story time together reading the Twits. I chose this one because I thought you'd all like it, all ages. So get comfy, get ready. The Twits by Roald Dahl. Chapter 1. Hairy Faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it's impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you or I wash the hair on our heads. There's the hairy men. So what I want to know is this. How often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to the barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed? Or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know. But next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things. Chapter 2. Mr. Twit. There he is. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted out in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that his hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand. But in truth, he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck straight out like the bristles of a nail brush. How often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly, nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. Next chapter is called Dirty Beards. Now, as you know, an ordinary unhairy face, like yours or mine, simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough. Nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in amongst the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel, and we quickly look more or less all right again. But the hairy men cannot do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. But not so with a hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream or chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on his hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking out of the hairs on his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you looked closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers and chicken livers and all other disgusting things that Mr. Twit liked to eat. You can see him there, getting the food stuck in his beard. Now you've got a close-up of his mouth and all the food. If you looked closer still, hold your noses everyone, if you peered deep into the muscly bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand, things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never went really hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. One more chapter. Mrs. Twit. Have a look at her. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that at any rate would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Now, why would this happen? I'll tell you why. You see, if a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on their face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose or a crooked mouth or a double chin or stick out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like a sunbeam, and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it, things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that always looked the other way. That's the end of story time today. If you come back tomorrow, we can read the chapter called The Glass Eye. I've been reading The Twits by Roald Dahl for you at Littlemead. See you tomorrow.